So in the literature review of this article, it basically talked about how the attitudes about gender could potentially influence different things, such as relationships, family interactions, and different gender roles. So throughout the past around 10 years, decades or so, there has been a growth of dual earner couples, couples who are both entered in the workforce and are both making money. So this study really expanded on gender attitudes by examining the differences in attitudes towards family roles between generations and within generations. So basically, how the different generations are perceiving these gender attitudes and how that affects the future generations. So really, they're basically trying to focus if parents are passing on their gender roles to their children, especially like in early childhood, which could really affect how gender roles are perceived, how gender roles keep being passed on by generation and generation, and how that affects, like I said before, the roles, the relationships, the family interactions, and basically as a result of a dual earner couple. So in the methods section of this article, 213 families were examined. There were different types of interviews. There were phone interviews, videotape interviews. Mostly people had to do one interview, but children had to do two, one alone and then one with their parents. And participants basically completed an adapted version of the attitudes towards family role scale, which was like a 13-item measure assessing gender-based attitudes towards family roles that were more traditional. So in the results, it basically found that even though the authors predicted that mothers would be less traditional than fathers, basically both moms and dads had very similar attitudes towards marital roles, except when considering like adding a child into the mix. So it really didn't matter if you were the mom or the dad in this situation most of the time, and traditionality wasn't really a factor there. In generational differences in gender attitudes, it was indicated that parents and offsprings differ in their gender attitudes. This further indicates that generational differences vary by gender, vary by offspring, and they also vary by ethnicity, which was also looked upon in this study. Offsprings were found to be less traditional than their fathers were, and daughters were also less traditional in the childbearing role than mothers and sons than mothers. And the sons in this situation really did not differ. So it was clear in this study that parents were way more traditional than the offspring for the most part, and contrary to the author's beliefs, they found that offspring education, which was something they tested for, was not a significant red flag when testing the attitudes towards roles in a marriage. Additionally, it was also discovered that when a father had more traditional attitudes towards marital roles, um, it would basically mean that the offspring or the child would be more traditional in their attitudes as well, because it would be basically passed on. And since the father's the head of the household, it's very traditional for this to happen in this type of setting. And lastly, gender and generational status are merely just two things that can influence gender attitudes. So many things can affect the way someone sees things, perceiving to marital status, gender roles. So many different things need to be considered, not just gender and generational status, but that really gives just a starting point as to what really causes these gender attitudes and how they have evolved through time and passed on through generations.